Tonight, we're going to journey back, far back, into one of humanity's oldest and most misunderstood stories. It's a story told not in grand monuments or triumphant songs, but in whispers, in shadows, and in silence. This is the history of what we now call prostitution, a story where desire, fear, faith, and survival all collide. It's a history that has followed humanity like a shadow, as ancient as civilization itself. So let's peel back the layers of time and see how a sacred act became a transaction. Imagine a world thousands of years ago, long before our modern cities. In this world, the body of a woman was seen as sacred. She wasn't just a person. She was a living symbol of fertility, of the earth, of the very rhythm of the cosmos. People looked at her and saw the reflection of nature's powerful cycles. Every birth, every harvest, every life-giving rain was tied to her power. She was the presence of the divine on earth, a channel for the forces of creation. This wasn't just a poetic idea, it was a fundamental belief that shaped entire cultures. Let's travel to ancient Sumer, in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Here, within magnificent temple cities dedicated to the goddess Inanna, lived her priestesses. They weren't just keepers of the temple, they were spiritual leaders. They prayed, they sang, they danced, and they led the sacred rituals of fertility that ensured the prosperity of their communities. Inanna was a complex and powerful goddess, the goddess of love, of war, and of creation. Her priestesses embodied these qualities. Like nature itself, they were seen as both nurturing and fiercely powerful. They stood as living bridges between the human world and the divine. In their faith, sexuality was not a source of shame or sin. It was a sacred gift, a powerful force of life and creation. To physically unite with one of these temple women was considered an act of worship, a way to touch the divine, to connect with the very source of life. In those times, sexuality was celebrated as life itself. The word prostitution, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist. These women were known as servants of the temple, honored figures who held a vital spiritual role. It's within these sacred rituals, however, that we find the distant, almost unrecognizable roots of what would later become prostitution. It started not as a transaction for money, but as an offering to the gods. But societies don't stand still. Over centuries, cities grew, empires rose, and laws were carved into stone. And with every new law came new rules, new prohibitions, and a new kind of control. The world was changing. Woman, who once belonged to the spiritual realm of nature and the gods, slowly began to belong to society in a different way. Her role became defined by lineage, by inheritance, by ownership. Her body, once a symbol of life's divine mystery, was reframed as an object of social and legal control. The emphasis shifted from her spiritual power to her role in producing heirs and maintaining property lines. As this shift happened, the great temples fell silent, the rituals changed, the sacred women once at the center of religious life began to disappear from their prominent roles. But you can't erase a fundamental human impulse. Desire can be silenced, it can be pushed into the shadows, but it can never be completely destroyed. And so, the practice survived, but it was transformed. From Sumer to Babylon, and from Babylon to the great Assyrian Empire, the act lost its holiness, but it endured. Women were no longer acting for the gods. They were now acting for their own survival in a world that had redefined their place. Society developed a strange and contradictory relationship with these women. It shunned them, ignored them, pushed them to the margins, yet it also depended on them. The demand was always there. Humanity, driven not by virtue but by the raw, undeniable force of necessity and desire, couldn't erase them. This is where we see the transition from a sacred duty to a social reality. The spiritual element faded, replaced by the practical needs of daily life for both the women who offered the service and the men who sought it. This new reality became so embedded in society that it had to be officially addressed. The famous Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest and most complete written legal codes dating back to about 1754 BC, speaks of them directly. The laws made distinctions. They mentioned some women who were still connected to temples, perhaps remnants of the old sacred traditions. But they also mentioned others, described as street women. Some of these women lived in designated areas. Some were required to register with the authorities, pay taxes, and follow specific rules. For the very first time in recorded history, prostitution was officially recognized and controlled by the state. Think about what that means. It was no longer a purely spiritual matter, nor was it seen as an unforgivable sin. It became a regulated act, a part of the city's economy and social structure. The state, in its quest for order, took what once belonged to the gods and made it its own. It took control of desire, taxed it, and legislated it. This pattern would repeat itself over and over again throughout history in different cultures and different empires. The history of prostitution is, in many ways, the history of humanity's unending struggle to understand and control desire. It shows us that every time a society creates a law or a moral rule, it also creates a shadow. And in that shadow, a secret world is born, a world that operates by its own logic. Prostitution has always lived in that world, hidden, quiet, often condemned, but always, always there. It's a mirror reflecting our changing values, our deepest fears, and our most persistent needs. It's a story not just about sex, but about power, economics, religion, and what it means to survive in a world that is constantly rewriting its own rules. When society pushed women beyond the boundaries of what was considered respectable, they didn't just disappear. They learned to survive on the other side of that line. For countless women throughout history, entering the world of sex work wasn't a choice born of desire, but a stark necessity for survival. In a world largely built by men, for men, they were often left without a voice, yet they remained unbreakable. Think about this paradox. The larger a society grew, the more its hypocrisy seemed to blossom. The very same people who publicly condemned these women were often the ones who privately sought them out. They preached morality in the open, but whispered of their own needs in the shadows. This profession has always existed in that strange, contradictory space, the gap between public denial and private desire. In the ancient world, the perception of women was deeply complex. She was at once an emblem of fertility, a sacred vessel of life, and simultaneously a symbol of sin. The gods might bless her, but men would judge her. Yet through all these eras, through all these judgments, she was never completely silenced. Her story persisted. It's fascinating how every civilization seems to create its own unique version of sin. And within each of those sins, we can find a hidden truth, a truth that the society fears most. The story of these women is no different. Even today, it lingers. You can feel it in the glow of city lights at night, see it in the fleeting glance of a passerby, and sense it in the unspoken spaces between words. This isn't just a historical account, it's a mirror to our own time. It represents that fragile, trembling line between desire and shame, a line we all navigate in one way or another. Let's take a moment here. Just take a slow, deep breath. Feel time itself slowing down around you. This isn't just a story about a specific group of women. It is a story about all of us, about humanity itself. It's a grand tapestry woven with the threads of longing, faith, fear, and sheer will to survive. These threads stretch across millennia, connecting us to our ancestors in ways we rarely acknowledge. And perhaps that's the very reason this story endures. Society changes, technology advances, empires rise and fall, but the fundamental nature of humanity, That remains remarkably constant. Desire, morality, prohibition, these forces are always at play, just wearing different masks for each new age. Now, let your imagination travel back in time. Close your eyes. Picture an ancient temple, silent and filled with the thick, sweet scent of incense. See the women there, praying, dancing, dedicating their lives and bodies to a goddess. They were part of a sacred tradition. Now, open your eyes and listen. Listen to that same profound silence as it echoes through the bustling streets of our modern cities. It has never truly disappeared. It has only changed its form, its context, its name. The history of prostitution can be seen as the echo of human desire, an echo that has been repressed, controlled, and judged through time. But you can still hear it. You can hear it in every age, within every faith, and across every culture. It's a constant hum beneath the surface of civilization. This is the story that humanity has tried to silence, tried to bury under layers of shame and judgment. But it's a story that could never truly be erased, because at its core, it speaks to something fundamental within us all. It was a silent whisper that echoed from the grand walls of Babylon, floated along the fertile banks of the Nile, and rode the winds across the Mediterranean Sea. This whisper spoke of the power of the body, the ever-shifting boundaries of desire, and the invisible laws that societies etched around them. Humanity evolved, but this core essence, this intricate dance between sanctity and taboo, remained unchanged. The female body in particular became a vessel for both life and societal judgment. Let's journey back to ancient Egypt, a civilization where women held roles more balanced than in many other early societies. Egyptian women could own property, run businesses, and even initiate divorce. They were forces to be reckoned with. Yet, even in this relatively progressive world, the politics of the body were ever present. Within the hallowed halls of temples dedicated to the goddess Hathor, women performed sacred duties. They danced, sang, and conducted rituals, their movements symbolizing fertility, harmony, and the cosmic order. These temple dancers were respected figures, their art a divine expression, but over time, a subtle shift occurred. The line between the sacred and the sensual began to blur. Context became everything. What was a divine ritual performed by a noble woman within the temple walls was a means of survival for a woman on the outskirts of the city, while women of high standing performed as musicians and dancers under the protection and prestige of the temples. Others, less fortunate, offered their bodies simply to live. And so began a long, complicated history of class-based morality. A world where the very same act could be deemed holy or sinful, depending entirely on who was performing it and where. The act itself was constant. The judgment was not. Now let's move westward, across the sea to ancient Greece, the cradle of philosophy and democracy. Here, prostitution became more structured, more defined. Greek society, in its quest for order, categorized its women into three distinct groups: the wives, who managed the home, the slaves, who performed the labor, and the hetairae. The hetairae were a class of their own. They were not just courtesans, they were educated companions, celebrated for their intellect and charm as much as for their beauty. Imagine a world where you could debate philosophy with Socrates one moment and compose poetry the next. That was the world of the hetairae. They were witty, cultured, and influential, sometimes even shaping political discourse from behind the scenes. But don't mistake this for true freedom. Their brilliance was celebrated only as long as it was presented through the lens of their physical appeal. Their independence was tolerated, but only within the strict boundaries established by the men who held power. The Greek state didn't outlaw prostitution. It organized it. In bustling cities like Athens, public brothels, known as porneia, were established and crucially taxed. The state was profiting from the very same acts it publicly condemned. It was a system of managed hypocrisy, Some of this tax revenue was even funneled into building and maintaining temples. It's said that the famous lawmaker Solon himself founded Athens' first legal brothels, a stark symbol of how sin and system could merge into a functioning, if morally ambiguous, part of society. Then came Rome, the empire of engineering, law and conquest, and with Rome everything became official. The Roman Empire took the Greek model and institutionalized prostitution on a scale the world had never seen before. Prostitutes, known as meretrices, were registered. They had to carry official identity records, pay taxes like any other profession, and were confined to designated districts, the infamous lupanars. The walls of these brothels, preserved today in places like Pompeii, tell a silent story. Etched into the plaster are names, prices, and even prayers. It's a haunting revelation that the oldest graffiti in Rome speaks not of emperors or generals, but of the anonymous women who lived, loved, and endured in the shadows of the great empire. Their stories are a testament to a complex history, one that we are still unpacking today. This journey through time shows us that our modern conversations about the body, desire, and morality are not new. They are echoes of ancient whispers, carried forward through the centuries. Majestic legions, grand aqueducts, and powerful emperors, right? But what if I told you there's another side to Rome? A story hidden in plain sight, etched into the very stones of its streets. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that reveals the complex soul of the Roman Empire, a subject that was both a public secret and a private indulgence. We're exploring the world of prostitution in ancient Rome and how it reflects the empire's deepest contradictions. In the bustling, crowded streets of Rome, prostitution wasn't just a clandestine activity hidden in the shadows. It was a structured, state-regulated part of everyday life. The state didn't just tolerate it, it controlled and profited from it. Imagine this, the same government that preached virtues like honor and family duty was also the largest manager of this trade. This wasn't about morality in the way we might think of it today. It was about order, control, and of course money. This control extended to the very appearance of the women involved. Roman laws were incredibly specific about how they should dress. They were required to wear short tunics, keep their heads uncovered, and often wear bright, garish colors. Think of it as a uniform. This wasn't a fashion statement, it was a form of social branding. It made them instantly recognizable, setting them apart from the so-called respectable Roman matrons who wore long stolas and covered their heads. This forced visibility was a powerful tool. It was control disguised as order, a way of marking certain individuals as separate, as other. It created a clear visual line between the wife and the courtesan, the mother and the outcast. Here's where it gets truly fascinating. The entire system was built on a massive contradiction. Roman society placed an enormous emphasis on public virtue and family honor. Prominent figures, like senators and orators, would stand in the forum and deliver powerful speeches about chastity, loyalty, and tradition. They were the guardians of Roman morality. But what happened when the sun went down? Many of these same men would navigate the winding alleys to the lupanars, the city's brothels. Public virtue thrived right alongside private indulgence. It was a classic case of do as I say, not as I do. The state itself embodied this hypocrisy perfectly. The empire imposed a tax on prostitution. So, on one hand, Roman religion and official philosophy might condemn the practice, but on the other hand, the imperial treasury was more than happy to collect revenue from it. This created a strange legal limbo. Prostitution was never fully legal in a way that granted its practitioners rights, but it was certainly not illegal either. It existed in a grey area that, arguably, every complex society needs to function. It was the space where official rules met unofficial realities. This system allowed the Roman elite to maintain a public image of piety while privately satisfying their desires. all while the state turned a profit. But this is not just a story of exploitation and control. Within this rigid and often brutal system, there were sparks of defiance, whispers of rebellion. These women were more than just silent figures in a system designed to contain them. Many sought ways to escape. We have records and archaeological evidence of women who managed to leave the lupanars and forge new lives for themselves. Their paths to freedom were diverse and incredibly difficult. Some saved enough money to open small shops, becoming artisans or merchants. They reintegrated into the very society that had once cast them out. Others became artists or performers, using their talents to build a new identity. And for those who couldn't escape physically, they found other ways to declare their existence. They left their mark, quite literally, on the world around them. Archaeologists have uncovered countless pieces of graffiti on the walls of ancient buildings, especially in places like Pompeii. Among the crude jokes and public announcements are small, personal inscriptions left by these women. A name, a drawing, a simple phrase. Each one is a tiny act of rebellion, a declaration that says, "I was here, I lived, I mattered." They are small inscriptions of existence, a way of speaking back to a society that tried to silence them. These traces, rediscovered thousands of years later, are silent but powerful memorials of their endurance and resilience. This is precisely what makes this history so compelling. It's a story that refuses to be erased. Every attempt by society to control, marginalize, or silence these women only seemed to amplify their presence in the historical record. They found ways to speak through stone, through art, and through the stories that have been passed down. In a way, their struggle for visibility is what has made them immortal. Prostitution, in all its forms, has always served as a mirror reflecting society's hidden self. It shows us what we publicly condemn but privately desire. Every era has looked into that mirror. Every civilization has seen a reflection of the things it wishes to deny about itself. The Romans saw their own hypocrisy, the gap between their stated ideals and their actual behavior. And they hid their contradictions there, in the dimly lit rooms of the lupanars and the carefully worded laws that managed the trade. And when Rome eventually fell, when new empires rose and new faiths spread across the world, did this fundamental pattern change? Not really. The questions at the heart of this issue remained the same, echoing through the centuries. To whom does a person's body truly belong? When is it sacred, and when is it considered a sin? What is the line between personal freedom and social control? These are not just ancient questions, they are timeless ones. And perhaps the answers have never really changed because, at our core, human nature hasn't changed all that much. We often forbid what we secretly desire, and we find ourselves desiring the very things we forbid. It's a cycle of prohibition and fascination. And the history of prostitution, from the streets of ancient Rome to the complexities of the modern world, remains the endless, unflinching reflection of that very human cycle. It challenges us to look beyond the simple labels and see the complex truths about who we are. As the mighty Roman Empire began to crumble, a new faith was quietly but powerfully reshaping the world. The age of many gods was giving way to the age of one. Christianity spread slowly but deeply across Europe, weaving itself into the very fabric of daily life. A new morality, a new language, and a new form of power were being born. And at the center of this new order, the female body found itself in a new and much darker light. It was no longer seen as sacred, but as sinful. Where the ancient world had often celebrated the body and its pleasures, the medieval world sought to conquer it. The goal was no longer earthly pleasure, but spiritual salvation. To reach heaven, one had to suppress desire. Flesh became the enemy of the soul, and woman, the symbol of that flesh, became the very embodiment of temptation. The early church fathers, Influential thinkers like Augustine, Jerome, and Tertullian wrote extensively about women, often describing them as the weaker flesh. They looked back to the story of Genesis and laid the blame for humanity's fall squarely on Eve. In their eyes, woman was the gateway to sin. This belief would come to define Europe's view of women for centuries. Her body was no longer divine, it was dangerous. In this new worldview, prostitution became more than just a moral failing. It was seen as a profound spiritual corruption. The prostitute wasn't just a fallen woman, she was a vessel of evil, a walking temptation threatening the souls of men. But history is full of ironies, isn't it? While the church officially condemned prostitution with all its might, it also, in a strange way, helped to preserve it. During the Middle Ages, a surprising consensus emerged. Prostitution was widely accepted as a necessary evil. The great theologian Thomas Aquinas famously wrote, "Remove prostitutes from society, and lust will destroy it." The logic was simple, and in many ways, cruel. To protect the virtue of good women, vice had to be contained and managed somewhere else. So instead of abolishing prostitution, cities began to regulate it. Brothels were legalized under strict controls. Women were forced to register with city officials. Municipalities, while preaching morality, collected taxes from these establishments in the name of maintaining public order. This created a deeply contradictory system. Prostitutes were confined to specific streets, often in the poorest and most undesirable parts of town. They were required to work only at certain hours and were sometimes forced to wear distinctive clothing to mark them as separate from respectable society. Their names were written in ledgers, recorded like property or livestock. The very system that excluded and condemned them also profited from their existence. These women were given no real place to belong. They were caught in a social limbo, not fully considered part of the living community, but not yet dead either. They were marginalized in life and even in death. The church often refused them burial in consecrated ground, the final act of exclusion. They lived on the fringes of society and often died in the streets, anonymous and forgotten. In a very real sense, they were forced to carry the sins of others, a heavy burden assigned to them by a society that needed a scapegoat for its own internal conflicts between faith and human nature. They were a paradox, essential yet despised, visible yet invisible. This complex and often tragic chapter in history reveals so much about how societies grapple with morality, power, and human desire. The story of the medieval prostitute is a stark reminder of how easily the most vulnerable can be sacrificed for the perceived stability of the whole. These weren't fashion statements, they were chains. In a time defined by faith and fear, society found countless ways to control its people, and for some women, the very clothes they wore became a prison. Sumptuary laws dictated what people could wear, a visual code for class and status, but for prostitutes, this went a step further. In some cities, they were forced to wear bright red, a color that screamed sinner from a distance. In others, tiny bells were sewn onto their clothes, a constant announcement of their presence, allowing the righteous to turn away in disdain. These sounds, these colors, were symbols of shame, a brand that society seared onto their bodies. It was a public declaration of guilt, a way for everyone else to feel clean by pointing out who was supposedly dirty. But here's the twisted truth. The hypocrisy that pulsed beneath the surface of this pious society. The very same priests who thundered against them from the pulpit were often the ones who sought them out in the dead of night. The same powerful nobles who publicly condemned them as unclean couldn't imagine their world without them. In the dark corners of medieval cities, sin and sanctity shared the same bed. This was the uncomfortable, unspoken reality of the Middle Ages. The system wasn't just about morality, it was about power and control. Prostitution in this era wasn't simply about desire, it was a crucial, if hidden, gear in the social machine. Think about it. Marriage among the nobility was rarely about love. It was a strategic transaction, a way to secure alliances, land and lineage. Passion, genuine emotional connection, and raw desire were often seen as disruptive, even dangerous, within the sacred bonds of matrimony. So where did all that repressed human energy go? It was displaced. It was outsourced to women who were designated to carry the burden of society's suppressed desires. Prostitutes became the silent keepers of secrets, the vessels for passions that had no place in the proper home. In the deep shadow cast by towering cathedrals and rigid moral codes, humanity revealed its truest, most complicated face. It's a paradox, isn't it? The existence of prostitution was seen as a way to protect the purity of virtuous women and the sanctity of marriage. By creating a designated outlet for male desire, the system believed it was preventing chaos. St. Augustine himself, a foundational figure in Christian theology, famously wrote, "If you do away with drains, the palace will be filled with pollution." In this grim analogy, prostitutes were the drains of society, essential for cleanliness, yet despised and hidden from view. This dual role played out in the most sacred of places, the church. In some parishes, prostitutes were allowed to attend Mass, but they were confined to the back pews. They were visible enough to serve as a living sermon on sin, a constant reminder of the fall from grace. Yet they were kept at a distance, untouchable. Their presence served a dual purpose. It reminded the congregation of the ever-present threat of sin, but also of the possibility of redemption and salvation. By casting all its collective guilt onto these women, society could wash its hands and cleanse its conscience, all while benefiting from the very sins it condemned. But please don't mistake this for a story of passive victimhood. Within this oppressive darkness, sparks of incredible resilience flickered. These women were not just symbols, they were human beings who fought to survive. Away from the judging eyes of the world, they formed quiet, powerful networks of support. They became sisters in circumstance, creating their own communities within the margins. They tended to each other's wounds, both physical and emotional. They shared what little food they had and fiercely protected their children from the harsh realities of their world. This wasn't a grand rebellion fought with swords and banners, but it was a rebellion nonetheless. It was a rebellion of survival, of empathy, of holding on to one's humanity when the world tries to strip it away. Their strength and solidarity won't be found in the grand history books written by kings and bishops, but it's etched into the very stones of those ancient cities, a silent testament to their endurance. As the centuries wore on, the world grew darker. Plagues like the Black Death swept across Europe, wiping out a third of the population. Wars raged, and a deep-seated fear began to permeate every aspect of life. In times of crisis, people search for someone to blame, a scapegoat for their suffering. The Church, finding it impossible to truly control sin through doctrine and law, shifted its strategy. If you can't control something, destroy it. And so began the age of the witch hunts. This wave of paranoia disproportionately targeted women. Suddenly, being an outsider, a healer, or simply a woman who refused to conform was enough to warrant suspicion. The definition of a witch became dangerously broad. A woman who lived alone, who understood herbal remedies, who asserted her independence, or who simply controlled her own body and her own life, could find herself accused. Many of the women condemned and burned at the stake were not practitioners of dark magic. They were simply inconvenient, disobedient, or feared. Their stories, their knowledge, their very existence were consumed by flames. But fire cannot destroy a memory. The ashes that were left behind still speak. If you listen closely, you can hear a whisper carried on the wind through the centuries. We were here, we existed, we survived. And as time marched forward, those embers of resilience began to glow once more. because history teaches us one undeniable lesson: that which is repressed never truly disappears. It waits, it transforms, it finds new ways to emerge. The history of prostitution is not just a story of sexuality or sin. It's a profound story about power, hypocrisy, and the incredible strength of the human spirit. It is a story of women who were forced to live in the darkest shadows of society, yet who managed against all odds to keep a light of their own alive. As the dark shadow of the Middle Ages finally began to retreat, a brilliant new light dawned across Europe: the Renaissance. It wasn't just a rebirth of art and science, it was a reawakening of the human spirit. For centuries, desire had been suppressed, the body hidden away as a source of sin. But now that was all changing. Art rediscovered the human form. Sculptors and painters, filled with a newfound reverence for classical antiquity, began to unveil the shapes and curves that had been concealed for a millennium. To gaze upon the body was no longer an act of transgression, but an appreciation of beauty. It wasn't about shame, it was about art. Yet in this dazzling age of rebirth, the line between pleasure and sin became more blurred than ever before. The female form, once seen merely as a vessel of temptation and shame, was suddenly elevated to the very center of beauty. Think of the great masters of the era: Botticelli, Titian, Giorgione. Their canvases come alive with the same powerful recurring image, whether she is a goddess, a saint, or a courtesan. When you look at Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, you're not just witnessing the rebirth of a mythological goddess. You're witnessing the rebirth of desire itself, brought forth from the sea foam, radiant and unapologetic. But there's a crucial detail we can't ignore. This newfound beauty, this celebration of the female form, existed almost entirely under the control of the male gaze. Women were idealized on canvas, their skin like porcelain, their hair like spun gold, but their own voices were seldom heard. They were objects of adoration, but rarely subjects with their own stories, and this shift had a profound impact on one of the world's oldest professions. Prostitution began to transform. It moved out of the dimly lit back alleys and into the opulent candlelit halls of the elite. In the bustling, wealthy cities of Venice, Florence, and Rome, a new class of woman emerged, one who was both admired and feared. They were the luxury women of the Renaissance, known as the courtigians. These were not the streetwalkers of the past. The courtigians were educated, eloquent, and wielded a surprising degree of influence. They could move effortlessly between the worlds of art, politics, and pleasure. Imagine a woman who could recite poetry from memory, play the lute to soothe a troubled nobleman, and debate philosophy with the brightest minds of her time. They were companions, confidants, lovers, and muses, all rolled into one. They were the living embodiment of the Renaissance ideal, beauty paired with intellect. Their elegance, however, was a gilded cage. They sparkled in the salons of Europe, their wit as sharp as their jewels, but they forever lived on the margins of so-called respectable society. A courtigiana could inspire a king to commission a great work of art. She could influence a poet's most famous sonnet, or even subtly shape political policy through her powerful connections. But she could never truly belong. Her very presence was a mixture of scandal and fascination, a walking contradiction. She reflected the core paradox of the era, a world that adored beauty but refused to grant freedom to the women who possessed it. The Renaissance glorified the female form in art, but continued to place heavy restraints on women in life. The very woman celebrated on canvas, immortalized in marble, remained bound by societal rules and expectations. This contradiction forced cities to confront the profession in a new way. It became both an aesthetic and a political issue. City governments began to regulate where these women could live, what they were allowed to wear, and how they could conduct their business. It was a strange dance of morality and pragmatism, officials would tax their earnings, filling the city's coffers while publicly pretending to uphold strict moral standards. In Florence, for example, prostitutes were forced to wear specific colors or distinguishing marks on their clothing to set them apart. In Venice, the city of canals and masquerades, a new symbol emerged. Red lanterns were hung in the windows of the districts where courtesans lived and worked. That crimson glow, reflecting on the dark water and cobblestone streets, became a signal, a beacon of both danger and desire. It symbolized the city's secret nights, the hidden world of pleasure that thrived just beneath the surface of the magnificent republic. The red light district wasn't just a place, it was an idea, a testament to the complex, contradictory, and utterly captivating spirit of the Renaissance. It shows us that throughout history, the story of beauty is rarely simple, and the story of the women who defined it is even more complex. Today, we're journeying back in time to the Renaissance, an era celebrated for its breathtaking art, groundbreaking science, and a flourishing of human creativity. We often picture grand cathedrals, visionary artists, and enlightened thinkers. But what if I told you there's another side to this story, a narrative painted in shadows and whispered in secret? A story where beauty and power were illusions, and the most celebrated women were also the most silenced. In the bustling cities of Renaissance Europe, a certain kind of woman became a mirror, reflecting the era's deepest contradictions. We're talking about the courtesan, the muse, the woman whose image was everywhere, yet whose voice was nowhere to be heard. Artists like Titian and Raphael immortalized them on canvas, their skin glowing with an almost divine light. Poets wrote verses praising their wit and beauty. Philosophers debated the nature of their charm. They were the inspiration for masterpieces that we still marvel at today. But behind every one of these iconic paintings, behind every celebrated verse, was a real woman whose own story was lost, captured only in brushstrokes and rumors, but never told in her own words. The Renaissance didn't just rediscover classical art, it redefined the landscape of power. And in this new world, prostitution, particularly at its highest levels, became a sophisticated language. The presence of a favored courtesan in a royal court wasn't just a matter of personal fancy, it could shift political tides. Her boudoir became an unofficial chamber of diplomacy, where alliances were forged and secrets were exchanged. A king's favor, bestowed upon a beautiful woman, could elevate her family, secure fortunes, and even influence the line of succession. Her beauty, it was said, could launch not ships, but treaties. Her charm could disarm enemies more effectively than any army. These women navigated a treacherous world of intrigue with astonishing skill, using their wit and allure as their primary weapons. They were players in the great game of thrones, wielding a unique and potent form of influence. However, this power was built on a foundation as fragile as glass. For every courtesan who achieved wealth and status, countless others lived in constant precarity. Her position was entirely dependent on the whims of powerful men. A single rumor, a malicious whisper spread by a rival, could be enough to bring her entire world crashing down. If her patron grew tired of her, or if a political shift made her inconvenient, she could be cast aside with no safety net. Her name, once celebrated in the highest circles, could be erased from the records as if she had never existed. She was a queen in a gilded cage, acutely aware that the lock was controlled by someone else's hand. This was the paradox of her existence, to be at the center of power, yet to be utterly powerless at the same time. The Renaissance is famous for putting the human form back at the center of art. After centuries of medieval piety, artists rediscovered the beauty of the body. Think of Botticelli's Venus, rising from the sea, or the countless reclining nudes that adorned the walls of palaces. It seemed like a liberation, a celebration of the natural world and of womanhood. But was it truly freedom, or was it just a new kind of chain, this time forged from gold and admiration? The nude body on the canvas wasn't an expression of the woman's own freedom. She wasn't the one who chose to be depicted that way. Her body became a spectacle, an object of desire and aesthetic appreciation for a male audience. It was a performance of beauty, not an act of self-expression. Similarly, the celebrated elegance of the high-class courtesan, her fine education, her sparkling wit, her exquisite taste in fashion and art, created a powerful illusion of empowerment. She seemed to be a master of her own destiny, a woman who had transcended the conventional roles of wife and mother. But this, too, was a carefully constructed facade that hid a stark reality of dependence. Her entire lifestyle, her very survival, was funded by the men who desired her company. She was seen everywhere, at parties, at the opera, in the most exclusive salons. She was admired, imitated, and talked about. But was she ever truly seen? Was the person behind the performance ever understood or valued for who she was, beyond her function as a beautiful object or an entertaining companion? The Renaissance put her on a pedestal, but a pedestal is still a form of confinement. As the great cities of Europe, Paris, London, Venice, grew into sprawling metropolises, so did the visibility of this world of pleasure and indulgence. These cities became grand theatres where desire was played out on a public stage. While the common people navigated crowded, muddy streets, the aristocracy and the newly wealthy merchant class built palaces with hidden chambers and secret gardens. Life became a series of masquerades, both literal and metaphorical, where identities could be concealed and forbidden desires could be explored. Pleasure wasn't just a private pursuit, it became a public spectacle and a powerful tool of politics and social maneuvering. In this glittering, decadent world, the female body took on a dual symbolism. It was at once the ultimate temptation, the forbidden fruit that everyone secretly craved, and a symbol of control, a prize to be won and possessed by the most powerful men. Historians looking back on this period sometimes call it the Golden Age of Sin. It's a provocative title, but it captures a fundamental truth about the era. The official moral authority, the Church, continued to condemn desire and preach austerity. But in the real world, especially among the elite, society had largely stopped pretending to listen. The desires that were once whispered in confessionals were now painted on canvases for all to see. The passions that were once silenced were now sung in operas and written into poetry. A grand hypocrisy was at play. Public piety and private indulgence coexisted side by side. And at the heart of this cultural explosion, one figure appeared again and again in countless forms: the woman. She was the divine muse inspiring the artist, the dangerous temptation luring the righteous man astray, the mythological goddess reborn, and the living mirror reflecting the era's complicated soul. She was all these things at once. Yet, let's peel back the layers of gold paint, look past the rich velvet and the shimmering light. What do we find? We find a profound and lingering silence. For all their visibility, for all the art and poetry they inspired, the women of this era, from the queen to the courtesan to the commoner, still could not speak their own truth. Their stories were told for them, their images were shaped by others, and their lives were defined by the men around them. They were seen, yes, they were worshipped, adorned, and placed at the center of the cultural stage. But they were so rarely understood. The Renaissance, for all its magnificent achievements, had rediscovered the beauty of the human form, but it had not rediscovered freedom, especially not for women. And so, history performed its age-old story once more, a story of objectification and control, only this time it was dressed in the most beautiful and deceptive costume yet imagined. Step into the gilded halls of the Renaissance, an age that rediscovered beauty, art and human potential. But beneath the velvet and gold, another story unfolded, one rarely told in the history books. This is the story of the women who became the era's muses, its secrets and its silent mirrors. During the Renaissance, the line between art and life blurred, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the lives of courtesans. Artists like Titian and Raphael immortalized them on canvas. Writers like Aretino penned verses inspired by their wit, and philosophers debated their role in a changing society. They were the heart of cultural salons, their opinions sought after, their presence a mark of prestige. But let us be clear, behind every celebrated muse was a woman whose own voice was often lost. Her story was captured in brushstrokes, her essence in poetic verses, her reputation whispered in rumors, but seldom, if ever, was it told by her. She was a reflection, a beautiful, captivating image in a mirror held up by men. In this era, a woman's body and influence became a currency of power, transforming the political landscape. A favored courtesan in a royal court could sway a king's decision, her boudoir becoming an unofficial chamber for forging alliances. In cities like Venice, Rome, and Florence, high-class courtesans weren't just objects of desire. They were players in a complex game. They were educated, skilled in music and literature, and possessed a social grace that rivaled that of noblewomen. Their influence was so potent that their favor could determine the outcome of diplomatic negotiations. The right word whispered in the right ear could build a fortune or dismantle an enemy. Their beauty wasn't just admired, it was weaponized. A strategic union could secure peace, while a perceived slight could ignite conflict. And yet, this power was built on a foundation of sand. Her position was utterly fragile. A single rumor, a shift in a patron's affections, or the fading of her youth could mean ruin. A whisper could erase her from the halls of power as quickly as she had entered them. Her name, once on everyone's lips, could be forgotten overnight, her story relegated to a footnote. The Renaissance is often hailed for redrawing the image of womanhood, celebrating the female form in a way not seen since antiquity. But did it truly liberate women, or did it simply chain them in new, more beautiful shackles? On one hand, it was a celebration of classical ideals and human beauty. On the other, the body on the canvas was rarely a depiction of the woman's own agency or freedom. It was a spectacle, an object for the male gaze, commissioned and owned by wealthy patrons. The courtesan, with her elegant gowns, refined manners, and intellectual prowess, presented an illusion of empowerment. She seemed to be in control, a master of her own destiny. But this illusion masked a deep-seated dependence. Her lifestyle, her security, her very survival were contingent on the whims of powerful men. She was seen everywhere, in paintings, at parties, in the streets. But was she ever truly seen for who she was, beyond the role she was forced to play? As the great cities of Europe, Paris, London, Venice, grew into bustling metropolises, so did the visibility of this world. These cities became grand theaters of indulgence and spectacle. Royal palaces weren't just centers of governance. They housed hidden chambers, hosted lavish masquerade balls, and were filled with secret desires. In this environment, pleasure was no longer just a private affair, it became a sophisticated tool of politics and social climbing. The female body in this context became a potent symbol. It represented both the ultimate temptation, a force that could lead men astray, and the ultimate form of control, a territory to be conquered and possessed. This period, which some historians have called the Golden Age of Sin, wasn't about a rejection of morality. Rather, it was an age where society stopped pretending to hide its desires. The church might still condemn carnal sin from the pulpit, but the world outside was busy celebrating it. Desire was no longer just whispered about in confessionals. It was painted on chapel ceilings, sung in popular melodies, and woven into epic poems. And at the center of it all, one figure appeared again and again. The woman. She was the muse who sparked divine inspiration, the temptress who tested a man's virtue, the myth who embodied unattainable ideals, and the mirror who reflected the era's own contradictions. In every painting, every melody, every poem, her image was inescapable. But for all the color and gold, for all the praise and adoration, a profound silence remained. While men of the Renaissance were finding their voices, publishing their thoughts, and shaping the world in their image, women were largely denied the same privilege. They could not speak their truth without being labeled heretical, hysterical, or worse. They were seen, worshipped, and adorned, every detail of their appearance scrutinized and celebrated, but they were rarely, if ever, truly understood. The Renaissance may have rediscovered the beauty of the human form, but it had not yet discovered the true meaning of freedom for half of humanity. And so, history performed its familiar story once more, this time dressed in the magnificent, deceptive light of velvet and gold. The stage was grander, the costumes more beautiful, but the script remained heartbreakingly the same. When you think of the Victorian era, what comes to mind? Probably stiff upper lips, elaborate dresses, and a society so proper it felt like everyone was holding their breath. It's the age of Queen Victoria, of Dickens, of industrial might. But what if I told you that behind those tightly laced corsets and behind the lace curtains of respectable homes, a hidden world of desire was simmering, ready to boil over? The Victorian age wasn't just the age of industry, it was the age of repression. And where there's repression, desire doesn't just disappear, it goes underground. Imagine London in the 19th century. The fog rolls in off the Thames, blurring the new gaslights that line the streets. In the grand houses of Mayfair and Belgravia, life is a performance. Respectability is the ultimate currency. Every word, every gesture is carefully calculated to maintain a flawless public image. But beneath this mask of perfect virtue, human nature, with all its longings and passions, stirred restlessly. The very society that preached purity was riddled with secrets. Hidden fantasies burned brightly behind closed doors, illuminated by candlelight. Now, let's travel just a few miles east to the poorest districts of the city, Whitechapel, Spitalfields. Here, the fog feels thicker, colder. The grand facades give way to overcrowded tenements and dark, winding alleyways. In these streets, the hidden desires of the wealthy found their outlet. For countless women, survival meant selling the one thing they had left, their bodies. We're talking about hundreds, possibly thousands, of women walking these same stone paths, selling themselves for mere pennies. Many were desperately young, some were sick, many were mothers trying to feed their children, and almost all were utterly alone in a city that had chewed them up and spit them out. Their names are mostly lost to history, erased from the official records, but their footsteps, their stories, are etched into the very stones of London. The class divide in Victorian England wasn't just a gap, it was a chasm, cruel and brutally visible. While a woman in Whitechapel might earn a few coins in a freezing alley, a wealthy gentleman could maintain a mistress in a secret, well-furnished apartment. She would be draped in silk and perfume, a hidden luxury, while the women in the streets literally froze to death. It was a staggering hypocrisy. The same society that publicly condemned prostitution and branded these women as fallen not only tolerated it but depended on it. It was a necessary pressure valve, allowing the elite to sustain their illusion of virtue while indulging their vices in the shadows. The system needed these women to exist in order to define what a good woman was not. This brings us to one of the most powerful and destructive ideas of the era, the splitting of the word woman in two. On one side, you had the angel in the house. This was the ideal Victorian woman, the good woman. She was expected to be pious, pure, domestic, and above all, silent and obedient. Her purpose was to be a moral guardian for her husband and children, a beautiful passive ornament in the home. She was not supposed to have desires of her own, or if she did, she certainly wasn't supposed to act on them. On the other side was the fallen woman. This was any woman who strayed from that impossible ideal, and the most visible example, of course, was the prostitute. She spoke when she should have been silent. She desired when she should have been pure. She acted with agency over her own body, even if it was out of desperation, and for that she was punished, ostracized, and cast out from respectable society. Victorian morality, with its rigid rules and public piety, built its very foundation on this brutal division. To have the light, they needed the dark. To have saints, they needed sinners. But human beings are not so easily categorized. And in the cracks of this rigid, unforgiving world, something incredible began to happen. Rebellion started to bloom. It wasn't loud or dramatic at first. It was quiet, determined, and grew from the very same streets that witnessed so much suffering. Women, seeing that the system was built against them, began to organize. They started forming unions to fight for better working conditions in the factories. They established schools for girls, believing education was a pathway to independence. They created shelters and homes for women who had nowhere else to turn, offering a hand of solidarity instead of judgment. These small grassroots efforts were the seeds of the first women's rights movements, the fight for suffrage, for legal rights, for the right to own property. It was all born from the realization that the system was broken. And incredibly, even the most marginalized women began to find their power in unity. Prostitutes, who were denied any voice in parliament or in the press, began to organize themselves. They supported one another in secret, sharing information, pooling resources, and protecting each other from violence. They didn't have a platform, but they had each other. Their whispers in the dark alleys became a chorus of mutual support. Think about the backdrop for all of this. The grey, smoke-filled skies of the Industrial Revolution, a world being remade by machines, by iron, and by steel. In this new world, women became the quiet, unacknowledged backbone of endurance. In the factories, their labor was exploited for pitiful wages. In the home, their emotional labor was taken for granted. And in the streets, their bodies were commodified and their lives dismissed. Yet through it all, their resilience grew. It became a force stronger than the steel being forged in the factories around them. Every single night in Victorian London, a door opened, a candle flickered, and a new story began. A story of risk, of negotiation, of a brief human connection, or of cold, hard transaction. The history of prostitution in this era is so much more than a story about sex or desire. It's a story about economics. It's a story about power. But most of all, it's a story about survival. It's about what people are willing to do to see the next sunrise, to feed a child, to simply keep going in a world that seems determined to crush them. And in that struggle for survival, the lives of these women became a mirror, reflecting humanity's deepest and most troubling contradictions. The Victorian era shows us a society that craved purity but was fueled by vice, that preached charity but practiced cruelty, that praised the family but tore so many families apart. The stories of these forgotten women are not just a footnote in history. They are central to understanding the true, complex, and often dark heart of the 19th century. Their resilience reminds us that even in the most oppressive of times, the human spirit finds a way to endure, to connect, and to fight for a better future. The 20th century. Has there ever been a time more chaotic, more brutal, and more transformative? It was an era defined by conflict, a century that saw 2 world wars, the collapse of empires, and the relentless rise of machines. Yet amidst the roar of cannons and the hum of factories, ancient questions echoed with renewed urgency. Who truly owns a woman's body? Who has the right to define what is moral? And when a voice declares something a sin, whose voice is it really? Imagine the world in 1914. As World War I ignited across Europe, millions of men marched off to the front lines, leaving behind a void. And into that void stepped women. They poured into factories, staffed hospitals, and ran offices. For the very first time in history on such a massive scale, female labor wasn't just helpful, it was essential. Society could not function without them. Their contributions were visible, undeniable, and powerful. But behind the heroic narrative of the war effort, a different kind of machinery was whirring into motion, the machinery of desire. Across the continent, brothels, so-called comfort houses, and rest camps began to appear near the front lines. Suddenly, women's bodies became another cog in the war machine, regulated, inspected, and institutionalized. The lines of morality, once so clearly drawn, became hopelessly blurred in the chaos of conflict. In cities scarred by bombs and shrouded in uncertainty, people were desperate for survival, and sometimes for a fleeting moment of solace. After the air raid sirens fell silent, you could hear laughter again, the sound of dancing feet. But beneath it all, a deep, quiet exhaustion had settled in. When the Second World War engulfed the globe, this grim system didn't just return, it deepened and became more sinister. In territories occupied by the Nazis, prostitution was militarized. Women were systematically forced into army brothels, their exploitation framed as a matter of military discipline and a necessary service. Their identities were stripped away, their names erased, and their suffering was reduced to cold, bureaucratic paperwork. This was the war behind the war, a silent, brutal conflict waged upon bodies. It's a part of history that is often left in the shadows, a story deemed too uncomfortable to tell. Then finally, the guns fell silent. The world exhaled a collective sigh of relief and began the arduous task of rebuilding. Cities were reconstructed, economies were revived, but for women, the fundamental story remained painfully unchanged. In the post-war years, women worked shoulder to shoulder with men to rebuild their shattered nations. They laid bricks, they typed memos, they raised the next generation. Yet they earned less, were expected to want less, and were certainly respected less. The conversation around prostitution shifted. It was no longer just a moral failing, but a social issue to be managed by the state. Some countries chose to legalize and regulate it, hoping to contain it. Others condemned it outright, driving it further into the shadows. But look closely at both approaches, legalization or condemnation, and you'll find a common thread: control. Whether through state-run clinics or police raids, the power over women's bodies and their choices remained firmly in the hands of others. The debate was about them, but rarely with them. But change was coming. By the middle of the 20th century, a new and powerful voice began to rise, a voice that had been suppressed for centuries. Feminism was finding its footing, and women started to articulate a revolutionary idea, simple yet profound. My body is mine. This one sentence was an earthquake. It challenged the very foundations of patriarchal systems that had stood for millennia. The term prostitute, once a simple label of shame, began to fracture under the weight of this new consciousness. The conversation became more complex, more nuanced. Some feminists saw sex work as the ultimate form of exploitation, a symptom of a society that commodifies women. Others, particularly sex workers themselves, began to argue for it as a form of labor, a choice, a means of empowerment and financial independence. For the very first time, women were seizing the narrative, demanding the right to define for themselves what their work, their bodies, and their lives meant. This wasn't just a debate happening in academic halls. It was a struggle playing out in the streets, in clinics, and in courtrooms. The fight for reproductive rights, the battle against sexual violence, and the demand for equal pay were all part of this larger movement to reclaim bodily autonomy. The 20th century started with women being treated as a resource for war and industry, their bodies managed and controlled by the state. It ended with millions of women standing up and declaring that they were not property, not a social problem to be solved, but sovereign individuals. The journey is far from over. The same debates about morality, choice, and control continue to rage today. But the legacy of the 20th century is undeniable. It was the century that laid bare the brutal mechanisms of control, but it was also the century that ignited the fire of resistance. It taught us that progress is never given. It is fought for inch by those who dare to speak their truth. The echoes of those brave voices still resonate today, reminding us that the fight for true liberation is a story that is still being written. We're going to explore how the 20th century, a period of massive social upheaval, completely reshaped the world's oldest profession. So grab a seat and let's get into it. The 1960s weren't just about peace, love, and rock and roll. They were a seismic shift in how society viewed everything, especially personal freedom. This was the era of rebellion, music, art, protests. It all became a form of political statement. And right at the heart of this cultural explosion was a new, unapologetic embrace of desire. It was no longer a whispered secret, but a bold declaration. It was during this time that a powerful new term entered our vocabulary: sex work. This wasn't just a change in words, it was a radical change in perspective. The goal was to reframe the conversation from one of shame and victimhood to one of autonomy and labor. For the first time on a grand scale, women began organizing. They weren't just asking for change, they were demanding it. They marched for their rights, for better healthcare, for safety on the streets, and for basic human recognition. The body, for so long a subject of control, became a site of resistance. Across the globe, this conversation was taking different shapes. In Europe, some nations took a pragmatic approach. Countries like the Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland began to legalize and regulate prostitution. The idea was to bring it out of the shadows and into a system where workers could be protected, taxed, and have access to social services. But this wasn't a universal solution. In many other parts of the world, the old laws remained firmly in place. Prostitution was still criminalized, and the stigma was as strong as ever. The world found itself divided, grappling with questions of morality, legality, and women's rights. But one thing had changed for good. Women were no longer silent. They were writing books, giving powerful interviews, and taking their stories to the streets in protest. They shared their experiences, their struggles, and their truths. And for the first time in history, the world was forced to stop and listen. These weren't just statistics or abstract social problems anymore. They were real people with real voices, demanding to be heard. As these social movements were gaining momentum, another powerful force was reshaping the landscape: the surge of modern capitalism. And capitalism, as we know, has a remarkable ability to turn anything and everything into a product. Desire became a commodity. The advertising industry, Hollywood films, high fashion, they all learned how to harness and sell the image of female allure. Suddenly, the very system that often condemned prostitution was simultaneously profiting from its aesthetic. Think about it. Every perfume ad that promised to make you irresistible, every movie poster featuring a glamorous femme fatale, every fashion magazine cover, they all carried echoes of the same age-old story. It was the story of the beautified body, of packaged desire, sold back to us for a price. This created a fascinating paradox. Society was both condemning and consuming the same ideal, often without even realizing the contradiction. The lines between art, commerce, and exploitation became increasingly blurry. As the 20th century drew to a close, the landscape of prostitution had transformed yet again. The rise of the internet created entirely new platforms and possibilities. The industry didn't vanish, it just evolved. It existed on websites and forums, in the bustling hearts of major cities, within the complex pages of law books, and as a constant theme in art and culture. The debate continued to rage, and the voices within it grew more diverse. Some women proudly called it work, a legitimate way to earn a living. Others described it as a form of violence, a symptom of a deeply unequal society. But on one thing, nearly everyone could agree. The experience was real, and it was theirs to define. The power to name their own reality was a hard-won victory. The history of prostitution had, in a way, come full circle. It journeyed from ancient temples to medieval streets, from the hidden shadows of Victorian society to the brightly lit screens of the digital age. What began as a topic steeped in shame and secrecy had finally become an open global conversation. It's a conversation that is still happening today, full of complexity and disagreement. But through this dialogue, women have steadily reclaimed what centuries of history tried to silence, their own voice. And that, in itself, is a profound and powerful transformation. I mean, really changed, not just the phones in our pockets or the cars we drive. I'm talking about something deeper, something fundamental to who we are. I'm talking about desire. The 21st century didn't just give us the internet, it gave the human body a completely new form. Desire, that ancient, powerful force, no longer just walks the streets. Now it glows behind our screens. The lights have changed, the sounds have become electronic, but that familiar ache inside us, that human longing, it still echoes just the same. Think about it. The ancient exchange of body, attention, money, and power hasn't disappeared. It's just moved. It's no longer happening in dimly lit alleys or hidden corners of the city. It's happening right here, in the quiet, glowing windows of online platforms. The internet didn't just change how we talk to each other. It fundamentally transformed the very nature of intimacy. With a single click, thousands of bodies are suddenly within reach. A stranger's gaze can cross continents in an instant. It feels like nothing is hidden anymore, yet at the same time nothing feels entirely real. And that's the great irony of our time, isn't it? Everything is visible, but nothing can truly be touched. We are more connected than ever, yet we can feel so incredibly distant. The wave of liberation that started picking up steam in the late 20th century has entered a wild new phase thanks to digitalization. The female body, which has always been a focal point of art, culture, and desire, became something more. It became a brand, a commodity, a constant stream of data. What used to be called sex work is no longer just a physical act. It has become a profile, a subscription, a meticulously curated flow of content. Some people look at this and call it freedom. They say women can now earn money on their own terms, without ever leaving their homes, without being physically touched. They have control. And in many ways they're right, but others look at the same picture and see a new kind of servitude. A system where people are controlled not by a single person, but by invisible algorithms and faceless corporations. A world where your value is determined by clicks, likes, and engagement metrics. And you know what? They're also right. The digital age didn't erase life's contradictions, it just multiplied them and put them on a global stage. A woman today doesn't need to walk a specific street to display her body. A camera, a microphone, and a stable internet connection are all she needs. The virtual body has, in many ways, become more powerful and has a farther reach than the physical one. But that power is incredibly fragile. The same image on a screen that can liberate and empower can also consume and destroy. A woman's voice can reach thousands, even millions, of people around the world. But that same system, with its complex rules and automated flags, can erase her with a single line of code. One day you're a star, the next you're a ghost in the machine. This digital revolution has completely rewritten the language of desire. What was once considered private, even forbidden, is now public advertisement. Privacy itself has become a product to be sold. Our emotions, our reactions, our deepest desires, they've all become data points. A photograph, a video, a simple emoji. These are the new currencies in the sprawling economy of attention. But if you strip all of that away, if you look past the technology and the trends, what's at the very center of this new economy? It's the same basic human need that has driven us for millennia. The need to be seen, to be acknowledged, to feel that we matter. Throughout history, people have presented their bodies in different ways and in different places. In sacred temples, on bustling streets, in lavish royal courts, on grand theater stages. Today, the stage is digital. The screen is the new mirror of modernity. It's where we go to see ourselves and to be seen by others. And in that mirror, a familiar face appears again and again, the face of woman. But now, that face, that image, that body, it doesn't just belong to her. It belongs to a market, to a system, to a vast interconnected network that is constantly watching, analyzing, and monetizing. Perhaps the most defining feature of our century is that desire is no longer local, it's global. In the past, a city's red light district was its quiet, contained secret. Now, the internet acts as a kind of global brothel, silent, endless, and completely borderless. Geography, religion, social class, and traditional morality, they all seem to collapse into a sea of pixels. And in that endless ocean of pixels, people are finding new ways to express themselves, to connect, to find community. But they are also, in some ways, losing themselves. We are all performing, all curating, all shaping our digital selves for an audience we can't see. We are both the product and the consumer, the performer and the spectator. The rules are still being written, and none of us really know where this is all heading, but it's a conversation we need to have. What does it mean to be human when our bodies and desires are mediated through a screen? What is real, and what is just a reflection? I'd love to hear what you think about all this. It's a massive topic, and your perspective is incredibly valuable. Leave a comment down below and let's talk about it. Artificial intelligence, virtual reality, digital simulations. These aren't just buzzwords anymore. They are reshaping the very fabric of our desires. For centuries, the idea of prostitution was tied to a physical person, an exchange of intimacy for survival or gain. But today, the prostitute doesn't even need to be human. Think about it. A body can be replicated with code. A voice can be imitated by software. Reality itself has become optional. It seems like we've delegated our most primal, intimate emotions to machines. This might just be the most profound transformation in human history, the great uncoupling of desire from humanity. It forces us to ask some really tough questions. What is sin in this new age? Where does morality begin and where does it end? If an image is generated by artificial intelligence, whose body is it? Is it anyone's? If an algorithm predicts what you want before you even know it yourself, is that desire still truly your own? Throughout history, prostitution has been a dark mirror, reflecting society's hidden impulses and contradictions. Now, that mirror isn't in a dark alleyway. It's the screen you're looking at right now, and it stares back, reflecting our own faces, our own contradictions. The word prostitute no longer points just to a person. It points to a system, an entire economy built on visibility and need. In this system, we are all a little bit exposed, a little bit silent, and we all carry a fragment of that collective desire. This leads me to a radical thought. Perhaps the prostitution of the 21st century isn't about bodies at all. It's about attention. Who is being watched? Whose voice is being amplified? Whose life gets the most clicks, the most likes, the most shares? Attention has become the new global currency. And in this new economy, every single one of us is a little bit of a seller and a little bit of a buyer. We sell our carefully curated moments, our thoughts, our smiles, in exchange for the validation of being seen. The modern world is full of irony, isn't it? We try to regulate and abolish the oldest profession, yet we seem to reproduce its core dynamic everywhere. Advertising, fashion, music, cinema, and especially social media, they all sell the same fundamental product, desire itself. They create an appetite and then offer a way to satisfy it for a price. That price might be your money, your data, or simply your focus. With this shift, the very meaning of sin has changed. In the past, sin was about indulgence, about giving in to forbidden desires. But today, in a world saturated with information, the greatest sin might be to go unseen, to be forgotten, to be ignored, to have 0 followers, to get no likes, to have your voice lost in the digital noise. That's the new version of hell. This story, which began in the temples of ancient Sumer thousands of years ago, now continues on our digital screens. Humanity is still circling the same fundamental question: who owns the body? But the answer is far more complex than ever before. The body might not even be flesh and blood. It might live as a profile on a social network, a collection of data in a database, a ghost in a server farm somewhere in a cold, remote location. When you look at it this way, the history of prostitution becomes the history of being human. Across all the ages, the surface details have changed, the setting, the currency, the technology. But the essence has remained the same. The deep, driving need to be desired, to be noticed, and ultimately to be remembered. In our digital age, to be visible is to exist. This is why the prostitute of the digital age is no longer just a figure on the margins of society. In a way, she represents all of us. We all live a part of our lives through these small, glowing screens, seeking validation, seeking eyes upon us, seeking connection. We all, in one way or another, sell parts of ourselves, our opinions, our creativity, our time, our privacy. And maybe that's the quiet, unsettling truth of our century. Prostitution is no longer just an occupation. It has become a metaphor for our modern condition. Under the constant flickering light of the screen, we have all become a strange hybrid, partly body, partly algorithm, and partly dream. We are all performers on a digital stage, selling a version of ourselves for a moment of attention. What do you think? Have we all become part of this new economy of desire? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Each age rebuilds itself, carrying the same emotions in different shapes. And the history of prostitution is one of the oldest echoes in that circle. A story that begins not with sin, but with something sacred. Nearly 5,000 years ago, in the sun-drenched city-states of Sumer, the human body first carried a divine meaning. Imagine stepping into the temples of Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Here, women stood as intermediaries between mortals and the gods. They were called holy women, priestesses, singers, oracles. Their bodies were symbols of fertility, of divine contact, of life itself. Through them, the community believed the world stayed in balance. They weren't selling a service, they were performing a sacred duty, a bridge to the heavens. But history is a river, and its currents change everything. Centuries passed, and the language of the sacred began to fade. The profound meaning behind the ritual started to thin, like a memory you can no longer quite grasp. The divine gesture, once heavy with cosmic significance, slowly transformed into an earthly act. And in that transformation, as the sacredness drained away, humanity invented a powerful new word: sin. The very act that once connected people to the divine was now seen as something that separated them from it. Let's travel along the timeline to the banks of the Nile. In ancient Egypt, the lines were beautifully blurred. We see women painted on temple walls, forever captured in elegant profile. They danced along the river's edge, their roles shifting with the tide. One day, a woman might be a revered priestess performing sacred rites. The next, a servant in a wealthy household. And on another, a companion for the pharaoh himself, her presence a form of royal pleasure. There wasn't a single, rigid label. Instead, there was a spectrum of roles, each woven into the fabric of Egyptian society. The concept of a prostitute, as we know it today, simply didn't fit into their worldview. Now let's sail across the Mediterranean to ancient Greece, a civilization that gave us philosophy, democracy, and a fascinating social paradox. Here, we meet the Hetairae. These were not just women of pleasure, they were educated, eloquent, and fiercely intelligent. In a society where most women were confined to the home, the Hetairae were a stunning exception. They could converse with philosophers, debate with politicians, and inspire artists. They were companions, thinkers, and confidants to the most powerful men in Athens. They existed among men as intellectual equals, not merely as objects of desire. Yet their fate was a tightrope walk. Society craved their wit and beauty, inviting them into the most exclusive circles. But at the same time, it despised them, branding them as outsiders who defied the traditional roles of wife and mother. They were desired and damned in the very same breath. From Greece, we move to the pragmatic and powerful Roman Empire. Rome had a genius for organization, for turning messy human behaviors into structured, manageable systems. And that's exactly what they did with prostitution. The complex tension that Greece struggled with, Rome transformed into policy. Women were registered, their names entered into official ledgers. They were taxed, turning their bodies into a predictable and reliable source of revenue for the state. They were even marked by law, sometimes required to wear distinctive clothing so they could be easily identified. For centuries, their presence became one of the empire's most stable, if uncelebrated, sources of income. The moral ambiguity was replaced by bureaucratic efficiency. It was no longer a question of sacredness or companionship. It was a matter of commerce and control. Then came a profound shift that would reshape the Western world forever: the rise of Christianity. As the new faith spread, the world seemed to dim. The classical view of the body, which could be a vessel for beauty, pleasure, and even divinity, was turned on its head. The female body in particular was no longer seen as sacred or powerful. Instead, it became dangerous, a temptation, a vessel for sin that could lead good men astray. Throughout the Middle Ages, this idea intensified. The woman was declared the carrier of original sin, a spiritual threat that needed to be contained. The sacred priestess of Sumer was now a distant, almost unimaginable memory. But here's the great paradox. Even with this new moral framework, the church could not erase prostitution. The desire, the demand, the economic reality, it was too deeply embedded in the structure of society. So it did the next best thing. It managed it. Prostitution was accepted, but as a necessary evil. The logic was that it was better to contain sin in a designated place than to have it spread uncontrollably throughout the community. It was like a sewer for male lust, preventing it from flooding the purity of the family. So, rules were created. Red dresses, bells to announce their presence, designated streets or districts on the edge of town, all of these measures served to mark and isolate these women, easing the conscience of the faithful. And this created a truly heartbreaking dynamic. The woman was publicly condemned. She was shamed, ostracized, and denied a place in respectable society. Yet her existence was essential to the very system that condemned her. She was the scapegoat, the necessary sinner whose existence allowed the rest of society to feel righteous. She was trapped in a circle of hypocrisy, a silent pillar holding up a moral code that branded her as untouchable. From a sacred bridge to the gods, to a necessary evil managed by them, her journey reflects the deepest contradictions in our own history, a story written not in stone, but in the flesh. Long before our modern world, in ancient societies, the lines between sacred and secular were often blurred. In the temples of Babylon and Greece, women known as priestesses served gods and goddesses, and their roles were deeply intertwined with rituals that were, to our modern eyes, quite complex. They weren't outcasts. They were integral parts of the spiritual life of their communities. Their bodies were seen as conduits to the divine, a bridge between the mortal and the immortal. This wasn't about commerce as we know it today, but about a cosmic spiritual transaction. The body wasn't just flesh, it was a vessel for belief. Then, the Roman Empire rose, and with it a new kind of order. Rome was a city of laws, legions, and above all, categorization. Everything and everyone had a place. It was here that prostitution was first systematically regulated, taxed, and documented. It became a formal, recognized trade. Women in this profession had to register, wear distinctive clothing, and pay taxes to the state. They were a part of the city's economic machinery, a visible, albeit marginalized, part of the social fabric. The spiritual aura faded, replaced by the practical, bureaucratic stamp of the state. The body was no longer a vessel for the divine, but an asset to be managed. As Rome fell and the medieval period began, a new power structure emerged: the church. The world was now seen through the lens of sin and salvation, virtue and damnation. The body, once a temple or a taxable asset, became a battlefield for the soul. Prostitution was condemned as a moral failing, a sin against God. Yet, paradoxically, it was also seen as a necessary evil. Thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas argued that while sinful, it channeled male lust away from virtuous women, protecting the sanctity of marriage and family. So, brothels were often tolerated, confined to specific districts, existing in a strange twilight zone, officially condemned but unofficially permitted. A society that preached purity relied on what it publicly shamed. The body was now a source of temptation, a moral paradox locked in a constant struggle between sin and necessity. Then, a great awakening swept across Europe, the Renaissance. It was like the world was rediscovering color after centuries of gray. The human body, so long shrouded in shame, returned to the light, celebrated in marble by Michelangelo and on canvas by Titian. Art began to rival religion as the new form of devotion, and into this vibrant world stepped a new figure, the courtigiana, or courtesan. She wasn't hidden away in a brothel. She walked into the grand salons of Venice and Florence. She conversed with philosophers, debated with scholars, and inspired poets. She was educated, witty, and admired for her intellect as much as her beauty. But even she, in all her celebrated glory, moved within invisible limits. Her freedom was conditional, existing only inside the circle drawn by men's admiration and patronage. In this glittering age, the perception of prostitution became less about universal morality and more about social class. The poor woman, selling her body out of desperation, was still on the street, still scorned. But the wealthy, cultured courtesan was in the salon, an object of art and desire. They were two sides of the same coin, really, both ultimately bound to the same male gaze. The stage had changed, the costumes were more elaborate, but the fundamental power dynamic remained. The centuries turned, and the world filled with the hiss of steam and the clank of iron. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just about building factories and railways. It reshaped society itself. Masses of people flooded into sprawling, overcrowded cities, seeking work. And at the factory gates stood women by the thousands. By day, they were laborers, enduring grueling hours for meager pay. But by night, many were forced to wander the foggy, gaslit streets, selling the only thing they had left to sell. This was the Victorian era, an age that famously covered its deep-seated anxieties and repressions with a thick mask of virtue and morality. It was a time of daytime prayer and nighttime shadows. Newspapers were filled with sensational stories of fallen women, painting them as tragic cautionary tales. Yet the very society that condemned them also fed on their labor and in many cases created the economic desperation that drove them to the streets. Prostitution was no longer just a scandal, it had become an unspoken part of the urban infrastructure. This is when the modern machinery of moral bureaucracy kicked into high gear. Police registries, mandatory medical examinations, and systematic taxation became the tools to manage and control this population. It was an attempt to contain a social issue by turning it into a series of administrative tasks. Then came the 20th century, and with it, wars that were more devastating than any before. These conflicts redrew not only the maps of nations, but also the meaning of the human body. War has always been brutal, but now, the body itself became a strategic tool, another front in the conflict. We see this in the horrific systems of sexual slavery established by military forces. Terms like comfort women, field brothels, and entertainment houses emerged in different languages, but they all describe the same unimaginable suffering. Women were once again systemically exploited, their bodies turned into instruments for a war machine built and run by men. But there was a crucial difference this time. The camera was now present. History was no longer just recorded in written accounts or personal memories. It was captured by the unflinching mechanical eye of the lens. Photographs and films bore witness, creating a permanent visual record of this exploitation. When the guns finally fell silent and the wars ended, the world was profoundly changed. But for all the shifts in geopolitics and technology, the fundamental issue of the body being controlled, commodified, and used as a tool of power persisted. The lens captured the truth, but changing it was another matter entirely. After the wars, a period of rebuilding and seeming conformity settled in. But beneath the surface, a revolutionary energy was gathering pace, and then it exploded in the 1960s. This wasn't just about new music and changing fashions, it was the era of the second wave feminist movement. For the first time in history, a widespread, organized movement of women demanded not just the right to exist, vote, or work, but the right to define themselves on their own terms. Out of this crucible of debate and activism, a new term was born: sex worker. This phrase was intentionally crafted to reframe the conversation. It moved the focus away from morality and sin and towards labor, rights, and agency. It was a radical act of redefinition. For some, this was a moment of liberation, a way to destigmatize the work and fight for the same protections and rights as any other laborer. For others, it was seen as a dangerous illusion, a new name for an old form of servitude that simply glossed over the inherent exploitation. But the most profound shift was this. For the first time, women in the industry were speaking for themselves in their own voices on a massive scale. On protest banners, in underground newspapers, in impassioned speeches, and in poetry, one simple, powerful phrase echoed louder and louder: "My body belongs to me." That phrase, just 5 words, drew a line in the sand. It divided the world. To many, it was the ultimate declaration of freedom, the bedrock of self-ownership. To others, it was a profound threat to social order, tradition, and established morality. It was seen as rebellion. But if history teaches us anything, it's that every revolution, every great leap forward in human rights begins as a threat to the old way of doing things, before it eventually becomes the new normal. The journey from the ancient temple priestess to the modern activist is a long and complicated one, a story of power, morality, and the unending struggle for control over the human body. And it's a story that is still being written today, Something that has moved from the street corners of history into the palm of your hand, onto the screen you're looking at right now. The red lantern, once a beacon in the night, has transformed. Today, it's a red notification dot, a small, persistent signal calling for your attention. The bustling, chaotic marketplace has been replaced by something far more sterile, yet infinitely more vast. The profile page. Think about it. The fundamental transaction has shifted. It's no longer just about a physical exchange in a specific place. The clients, the patrons, are now unseen, hidden behind usernames and avatars. The intermediaries are no longer people, but code, servers, and algorithms. These are the new high priests of our modern temples, dictating who is seen, who is valued, and who is desired. The architecture of connection has been completely rebuilt. This brings us to a fascinating and perhaps uncomfortable question. What does the word prostitution truly mean today? Is it still just an occupation, or has it evolved to describe something deeper, a state of being that resonates with so many of us? It seems to describe a fundamental human longing, the longing to be seen, to be validated, to matter in the eyes of others. This is a desire that has powered human interaction for millennia, but now it operates on a global, instantaneous scale. Every time we share a picture, we're engaging in a modern ritual, showing a face, displaying a moment of our lives, curating an image of ourselves. Each action is part of the same ancient pattern. In antiquity, offerings were made to the gods, hoping for favor, for blessings, for a good harvest. The body itself was sometimes seen as an offering in sacred rituals. Today, who are we making offerings to? The body, the image, the carefully crafted moment. It's offered to the gaze of the crowd. The audience has become the deity. The setting has changed from a stone temple to a digital feed, but the core impulse remains eerily familiar. The irony of history is truly striking when you look closer. Some of the earliest recorded forms of prostitution were tied to temples, where women were considered sacred, their bodies a conduit to the divine. Fast forward to our digital age. Who are the new sacred figures in our digital temples? We call them influencers, models, content creators. They stand in a similar, brightly lit space, capturing the attention and adoration of millions. But here's the crucial difference. The God being worshipped is no longer a distant, supernatural entity. The God is us, humanity itself, the collective spectator, the endless scroll, the sum of all our likes, comments, and shares. We have created a pantheon where we are both the worshippers and the worshipped, trapped in a feedback loop of seeking and granting attention. We sacrifice our privacy for visibility, our authenticity for applause. We are performing for an audience of everyone and no one all at once. Through all these transformations, from ancient temples to digital platforms, one thing has remained remarkably consistent. Women have often been at the center of this dynamic, their bodies serving as a canvas upon which society projects its desires, its fears, and its ideologies. They have been the carriers of civilization's conscience, their roles and images rewritten by every new era. Sometimes blessed as sacred, sometimes cursed and marginalized, but never ever forgotten. Their presence is a constant mirror reflecting society back at itself. Why is this? Why does this pattern persist? Perhaps because humanity cannot exist without its own desire. Desire is the engine of our world. It drives us to create, to connect, to build, to strive. It is the force that pulls us out of bed in the morning and keeps us scrolling late into the night. It is the invisible energy that powers our economies, shapes our cultures, and defines our relationships. And in our modern world, this desire has found its ultimate expression online in the endless, intoxicating quest to see and be seen. This isn't a judgment. It's an observation about the world we've built, We are all participants in this grand performance, whether we are creators or consumers, or more often, both. We are all seeking something: connection, validation, a sense of belonging, a fleeting moment of being truly seen in a world of billions. The tools have changed, the scale is unprecedented, but the human heart at the center of it all remains the same. It's a story as old as time, simply retold in the language of pixels and code. The questions we must ask ourselves now are more important than ever. What is the price of being seen? What do we gain? And what do we lose when our value is measured in likes and followers? As we continue to build this digital world, we are also defining what it means to be human within it. The story is still being written, and we are all holding the pen. What will the next chapter look like? The answer to that lies in the choices we make every single day. With every click, every post, every moment we spend in this new global temple of attention. We read about grand battles, the rise and fall of kings, and sweeping revolutions. These are the bold headlines of our past. But what about the stories whispered in the margins? The tales that unfold not in the halls of power, but in the quiet corners of civilization. A woman's hushed voice, the creak of a door in a dimly lit alley, a secret shared in the dark. Without these silent stories, our understanding of history and of ourselves is fundamentally incomplete. Imagine for a moment that we could listen to all of history at once. What would we hear? We might hear the hymn of an Enheduanna, a Sumerian high priestess, her words echoing through millennia. We'd see a crude carving on a Roman wall in Pompeii, a fleeting message of desire frozen in volcanic ash. We'd feel the silent tear of a medieval woman, her life dictated by forces far beyond her control. We'd gaze upon the portrait of a Renaissance courtesan, her expression a complex mix of intellect, beauty, and commerce. We'd hear the echo of footsteps on a foggy Victorian street at midnight and see the cold blue flicker of a digital screen in our own time, connecting strangers across the globe. All these moments, separated by thousands of years, cultures, and technologies, carry the same underlying rhythm. It's a rhythm that beats at the very core of our existence, humanity's deep, unwavering, and often complicated longing for connection, for intimacy, for itself. When we trace the long and winding history of prostitution, we aren't just looking at a single profession. We are, in fact, charting the history of how humanity has grappled with its own desires. This isn't a simple tale of shame to be tucked away and forgotten. It is a story of memory, woven into the very fabric of our collective consciousness. Shame is a powerful force. It often lives deep within us, a part of our consciousness that we try to suppress, but can never truly erase. Throughout history, societies have built elaborate structures to manage and conceal it. We've created laws, designed complex social systems, and even invented new words, all in an effort to hide this fundamental aspect of our nature. But desire, like a powerful river, always finds a way to return to the surface. It can't be contained forever. And why? Because the story of desire is not separate from the rest of human experience. It is inextricably linked to the story of art, of creation, of innovation, and ultimately, of what it means to be human. The same impulse that drives us to seek connection also drives us to paint masterpieces, to compose symphonies, and to build civilizations. They are two sides of the same coin. So to speak about prostitution today, openly and honestly, is to do something profoundly courageous. It is to look directly into humanity's shadow. Now, that word shadow can be intimidating. We often associate it with something dark or evil. But a shadow is not inherently evil. It is simply that which has been left in the dark, that which has been forgotten or ignored. To face this shadow, to bring it into the light, requires us to set aside our preconceived notions and our discomfort. It requires us to listen. And for those who dare to look, who dare to listen, a remarkable thing happens. You begin to see not just a single figure, not just a transaction, but a reflection of all of humanity. You see our complexities, our contradictions, our vulnerabilities, and our enduring resilience. You see a story that is as old as civilization itself. History whispers a timeless truth to us. Bodies are temporary, political systems crumble and are replaced, empires rise and fall, but desire remains. It is a constant, a fundamental driver of human behavior that persists through every age. And as long as it does, the story of desire will forever be the story of being human. It is our story.